Welcome to Catholic Discovery 101. My name is Liz Johnson. I'm a parishioner at the Holy Spirit Catholic Community Church. And our guest today is Pete Espil. Pete is the campus minister for St. John's Student Center here in Pocatello. He's also an author. And today we're going to be talking about his book, Teen for Christ. And the beginning of the book starts with Pete's own conversion journey. Next month we will talk about a little farther into the book and some of the stuff, how it applies to specifically to other teens. Pete, welcome. Thank you for coming today.
Thanks for having me today, Liz.
Okay. So let's talk about the beginning of your book. You set the stage in your book with your early teenage years. And you talk about people who influenced your life, and you put them into categories. Mm-hmm. Explain those categories to us a little bit.
Well, you know, I wrote the book over a 6-year period, and I was working in youth ministry at that time. And all the research that I read about teenagers and all of my experience with teenagers, including my own experience as a teen a long time ago, kind of really drives home the importance of relationships and how important relationships are to all of us, but especially to teenagers. And I was trying to think of a way to start the book that sort of made that point without doing it in a really dry way. And so I kind of, at the beginning of the book, and it's only a short portion of the book, but I talk about different people that we run into in our lives. And some of them we meet, we know them for a short time, and then they sort of disappear for whatever reason. We make a lot of friends growing up, and the reality is we really don't stay in contact with very many of them, if any. Mm-hmm. And that's just, like I said in my book, it's not a good or a bad thing, it's just a thing. And then there are people who we meet and we feel some kind of a connection with them. We think that they're special in some way, but we're not sure why. And many times these people may disappear for a while and then show back up at an important time. And that is what this book is structured around. It's sort of structured around my experience with my first spiritual advisor. And I was not a teenager, but I knew as a teen there was something special about an event that happened to me that, applies to this person who came into my life later. Mm-hmm. So anyway, I guess that's the best I can do on explaining that.
I really liked how you tied all these people together in your life, how they influenced you along the way, and someone would show up and then maybe come back, and that God puts people in our path for a reason.
Right, and the whole point, and I don't say much about this in the book directly, it's sort of implied, but the whole idea is that you can look back later and go, oh, that's why that happened, or that's why God brought that person into my life, or that's why God didn't answer that particular prayer.
Yeah, the way I wanted it.
The way I wanted it. And so I don't ever really say that in the book, but it's sort of implied. Mm-hmm. And I think it's an important thing, especially for teenagers, but for all of us, because those teenage years can be pretty confusing, and you're trying to figure out your own direction in life, and it can get confusing.
It can.
And I guess the other thing that's implied is in the book is just kind of relax. It's going to work out, but just kind of focus on these things about your journey with Christ as opposed to all these other things, and it's going to work out.
Yeah. Yeah, God does have a plan, and maybe these aren't the best years of your life, like so many people think.
They were pretty good for me. I'd go back, but they are rough for a lot of people.
They can be very, very rough. Yeah. And please don't think that this book, Being a Teen for Christ, is only for teens. I really enjoyed the book. I loved. I like people's conversion stories and the path they go along, and then how teens today and not just teens, but everybody else can apply these steps in their life is great. So let's talk about you growing up.
Well, I want to say it's not just for teens. My father-in-law, who's 69, is reading it, and he loves
good.
it. So
I loved it.
yeah, it's for anybody, but
it is.
But I did have teenagers in mind
when you wrote it.
Yeah.
Well, you cross generations with it. So let's talk about a little bit about growing up Mormon in Kimberly, Idaho. And I don't want to give a whole lot away because I want you to seek out the book, but I loved your story about burning down the farm.
Oh my goodness, now it's going to be on TV.
Hey, I just want everybody to know I laughed, I cried, and it brought back great memories of my own son trying to burn down the house.
Yeah,
yeah, it's just a rite of passage.
You know, I want to say I grew up in Kimberly in a strongly LDS community. My mom was and still is devout LDS, and she loves me. I love her. We get along fine. There's no problems with my conversion to the Catholic Church, and I have nothing negative at all to say about my LDS friends growing up. So I just want to make that clear because we have a high LDS population, certainly here in Pocatello as well. But my friend Matt and I were very, very close, and he's the one that was with me when the farm burned down. And I don't want to say too much about it, but everywhere I've worked with teenagers, they're all familiar with Pete and Matt's stories. And the funniest thing about the farm burning down was that one, that it happened right before our sophomore year, and we'd been friends, very close friends, since second grade, and tons of other things had happened. And it's just a miracle that didn't happen earlier. The other funny thing about it is for years nobody knew how it happened, like what really caused it.
Oh.
And years later, when Matt and I were both married, and he was home for Christmas, so I went over with my wife Jamie, and we were over there talking, and I thought by that time he had told his parents how it really happened, and well, he hadn't. And so there was an interesting kind of exchange there. It felt like we'd been reverted back to fourth grade as his mom interrogated us once she realized that she did not have all the information about it. That's not in the book, but it was a funny,
Well, and I think all parents who have adult children realize how much we truly didn't know about our kids growing up as we learned some of these stories of their childhood. And God probably does that to keep us sane so that they live through their childhood.
Well, my mom, lots of times over the years when I'd start talking about things, she'd be like, just stop, don't tell me, I don't want to know. I just don't. Yeah. It's better that I don't know. I said, okay.
That's true. So one of the stories that I really liked in your book was a Wednesday night field trip to a Catholic monastery.
Yeah, I, like most teenagers, I was not a fan of church. And, my mother, bless her heart, just made church a priority in our house. My dad was not LDS, and my dad's side of the family is Basque, so he was, I guess, culturally kind of a Catholic, but not practicing. And my mom took us to, we went to church on Sundays. I used to jokingly call it the Mormon Marathon because it was 3 hours, but we went to church on Sunday, and Wednesday night we went to what was called Mutual, or he's basically youth group. And we went, and whether we wanted to or not, we got our butts in the car and went, all through high school. And one Wednesday night we went, Mom drove me into the church parking lot, and there were all these vans, which, is pretty normal for an LDS church. Everyone has big families, but they were looked like rented vans or something. They were white. And so the first thought that comes to my mind is we're going to clean up some lady's yard, because we're always doing service, which is one of the things I love about the LDS church.
Me too.
And so that's what I thought we were doing. And of course I'm a teenager. I'm like, here we go again. Got to go clean up some yard, And And we got inside, and I said, "What are we doing tonight?" And our leader said, "We're going to a monastery." And I didn't even know monasteries still existed. I thought they were just in movies, or, you know, I jokingly say I thought they were still in Monty Python movies, or something, you know. And I said, "Really?" And they said, "Yeah, we're going to a monastery." And I said, "Like a Catholic monastery?" And yeah. And this was really out of character. The LDS Church, I think, has grown some in its ecumenism and its willingness to kind of cross some borders. Mm-hmm. But when I was growing up in small town Kimberly, you know, that was just not something you would ever imagine happening. Mm-hmm. In fact, we were taught pretty strongly that other churches, we should stay away from them. And that the worst was the Catholic Church. And I, you know, again, with all due respect to my LDS friends, that's just what we were taught. So this idea that we're going to a Catholic monastery was just, I thought they were kidding, you know. And then when they said it was in Jerome, I was just like, really? There's a monastery in Jerome, Idaho? I mean, you could have told me there was a space station there, and it would have surprised me just as much. But we went out to the Monastery of the Ascension. And I mean, there was so much tension, you know, us Mormon kids getting out of these vans, like just who had been told, you know, that this don't go to other churches. The Catholics are the worst, you know. We're just like on eggshells, you know. What are we doing here? Are we gonna get in trouble for this? You know? But our youth group leader was pretty kind of progressive, you know. I mean, he really wanted us to see different things and understand different things. And so we're all standing outside in the parking lot just looking around, you know, and out comes this monk. And I think it was Father Meinrad. It's hard to remember, but he comes out and he's just smiling, and he walks over to us very calmly, and he says, "Good evening, everyone, and my name's so-and-so." And he goes, "I'm a monk, and this is what a monk looks like in their habit." And we're all like, we didn't even know what a habit was, but we assumed it was his robe. And he goes, and then he flips his hood up, and he goes, "And this is what a monk looks like with their hood up." And we all started laughing. And at that point, the tension broke a little bit, and they took us on a tour, and we sat in while they did Vespers, and it was quite an experience.
So you go into a little bit about your what you felt at the monastery, what your impressions were.
Well, it was extremely peaceful. I was very confused because I didn't understand any of the words they were using. I didn't know what Vespers was, or divine office, or icon, or pieta, or I didn't know. None of us did. Mm-hmm. And so, but we were afraid to ask questions, so we just kind of, you know, stood there. But I was really impressed by how peaceful it was. And some stuff I don't talk about in the book was when we had the question and answer session. I didn't believe the monks when they told me that they stayed there their whole lives to work and pray. I didn't believe them. I thought they were just telling us that, like as a line or a selling point or something. I mean, and you know, and so I was this teenager who was usually, I mean, I was most concerned about where the parties were going to be that weekend, you know. I was kind of a Jack Mormon, you know, to use a term that they sometimes use. I went to church because Mom said, but I wasn't a very good Mormon in high school. And so we're driving away from that place, and I'm just thinking to myself, you know, I was thinking about how peaceful it was, but I couldn't get over kind of the commitment that these men made. Mm-hmm. As Mormons, we kind of wore a badge of honor when it came to missions, you know, like, well, we go away for 2 years, you know. Yeah. And I didn't ever go on a mission, but I went in the Marine Corps instead. But I'm like, I was always thinking that, well, we go for 2 years and other churches don't do this or don't do that. And then I go to this monastery and I'm like, your whole life? You know,
you give everything up?
I was just so selfish, like, you know, most adolescents are. And I couldn't imagine, you know, this.
Doing that.
So that had a huge impact on me. And, you know, and then I kind of forgot about it after a while. You know, I didn't think about it anymore.
So you mentioned you went into the Marines. You went in at age 17?
I did, yeah.
Right before you graduated?
I left early. I left high school early and went into the Marine Corps. And I turned 18 in boot camp, actually.
In boot camp?
Yeah.
Okay.
which can be a bad thing if they find out it's your birthday in boot. Anyway.
Oh, it's not.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay.
But that's
It's a
anyway.
whole nother story.
It is, yeah.
So after the Marines, somewhere in there you met Jamie, and her religious background wasn't LDS or Catholic.
No, Jamie. I met Jamie, my wife. She's my second wife. I married right after I got out of the Marines. I was married in the Los Angeles Temple to an LDS gal, and it didn't last very long. And if you want to read all about that, you can read about it in my first book. But but yeah, I met Jamie, and she had been raised Seventh-day Adventist. And at the point that I met Jamie, I would say I was an agnostic. I had left organized religion. I kind of felt like there might be a God, but if there was, it was an impersonal God, and it didn't really matter to us here. But Jamie, and the joke I always make was, I was dating this girl, and she was pretty cute, and
She's still pretty cute.
she is, and she wanted to go to church if we were going to date, and I didn't want to go to church, but she was cute, so
You were a young man.
I agreed, and she was Seventh-day Adventist, and so here you got a Mormon background agnostic dating a Seventh-day Adventist. I think the only thing that those two faith traditions have in common is how much they hate the Catholics. Traditionally, even in things are changing. It's a little bit, but I went to her church once and hated it. I couldn't stand it. It was the most, I don't know. I just couldn't do it. So we ended up agreeing to go to this non-denominational church. And that's where we attended for quite a while. We were married in that church, and we still have very good friends from that church. In fact, several of them were at Jamie's 40th birthday party in February. It was good to see them, and so that's kind of how that went down.
And you make some really good points in your book, because you've met people from all religious backgrounds, and a lot of the stereotypes that we think don't really fit as you form those friendships.
Yeah, it's easy to label a group of people, and that's what happens. We do that all the time, not just with religion, but with, we label groups of people, and when we label groups of people, we strip away their humanity. And so I'm really glad that I've met folks from different backgrounds and continue to meet people from different backgrounds. It helps me not label. And
it also teaches you more about your own faith.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, it does. So the church that you guys were married in, that still didn't fit quite right with you.
Well, I started to have to ask myself some questions, and it was kind of like, if I'm going to go to church, then it should be something I do based on what I think is right, as opposed to whatever one's the closest. And so I started to study, and I started with the history of Christianity, because I'd been taught as a Latter-day Saint that the church fell apart in the early centuries, and that Jesus took his authority from the earth, and there was no valid, really no man able to act authoritatively for Christ. And so I said, well, I wonder if that's true. I mean, let's go back to the beginning. And so I went back, and I surprisingly found there is a lot of information about the church in the early centuries and all the way up to modern times. There are periods of time where there's less information, but there's still plenty of information and history. And so I studied church history, and that's where I started. And I studied for a couple years, and then I eventually came to the conclusion that I needed to become a Catholic. And then I had to decide whether it was a Roman Catholic, a Western Catholic, or an Eastern Catholic, Orthodox. And I eventually decided I needed to be a Roman Catholic. And it was purely intellectual. It didn't have anything to do with giving my heart to Christ. That came later, but it was this idea that I was needed to, that was the church that I believed Christ established.
And that was the intellectual part. And you talk about that. You had an intellectual conversion. Your head was there, but not your heart.
But not my heart, yeah.
And you met a very spiritual man who helped you on that journey.
Yeah, he was spiritual. Some would say he was very unique. But we ended up at the monastery. When I started taking the classes to become a Catholic, we ended up back at the monastery. And that brought the monastery back into my life. And years went by, and I'm looking at the screen. We have 8 minutes, but we may have to pick this up in the next show. But I eventually ended up with a spiritual advisor who was a monk from the monastery named Father Simeon. And he was retired and living at St. Paul's Catholic Center on the Boise State campus. While I became good friends with him, and he became my spiritual advisor the last couple years that he was alive, about the last year and a half that he was alive. And I was, by that time, I was working at St. Paul's Church in Nampa. So St. Paul's in Boise was the Newman Center where Father Simeon lived, and St. Paul's Catholic Church in Nampa was where I was working. Great parish. I still consider St. Paul's my home parish, even though I came into the church in Twin Falls, and I love St. Edward's, but I still consider St. Paul's my home parish because of all they did for me while I was there. But,
help you with it.
Yeah, but that's where I met Father Simeon, and he was instrumental in me learning how to go from my head into my heart. Mm-hmm. And he used among other things, he used the Beatitudes to kind of do that. And all 3 of the books I've written are really heavy on the Beatitudes. In the
Beatitudes, that's true. You have a workbook about the Beatitudes too, working through them. In your book about recovery, I liked how you tied the Beatitudes in with the 12-step programs that are available out there.
Yeah, they're real quickly, both of my other books. My first book is about it, like you said, it ties the 8 Beatitudes into the 12 steps of recovery. I talk a lot about my own recovery from alcoholism in that book. And my second book, Beatitudes in My Back Pocket, it's 8 weeks of spiritual exercises based on the Beatitudes is what it is. And each one approaches the Beatitudes differently. Some people that have read all 3 are like, well, in this book you say this about the Beatitudes, and in this book you say this. And I said, well, yeah, and maybe you'll find your own interpretation of how to apply them. These are just my interpretations and perspectives based on my experience. They're by no means dogmatic.
Yeah. And a lot of them are in the moment, what you're experiencing in your life. It's like the Bible. You can read one passage one day and get something out of it, and a year later read it and it has a totally different meaning to you because you're at a different place in your life. So let's go back to Father Simeon a little bit. You had some great stories in there about him. I particularly like the one when you're really down on yourself and you're questioning yourself as a Catholic. Tell us a little bit about that.
I don't want to tell too many of the stories because there's some really powerful stories in there about Simeon. And I still visit Simeon every time I go to the monastery. His grave is there, and I go out and talk with him. But I was in the chapel. This was before he was my spiritual advisor. I was sitting in the chapel at St. Paul's at Boise State. I was attending classes there while I worked at St. Paul's in Nampa and working on finishing my undergrad. And I was just having a bad day, and I just felt like Paul writes about the things I want to do, I don't do, and the things I do, I don't want to do. And I was sitting in the chapel and just kind of having a rough time, and Father Simeon walked past, and I guess he could tell I was having a rough day. So he comes over and he says, "Are you all right?" And he always called me Peter. And I said, "Yeah, Father, I'm just having a rough day." So what's the matter? And I said, "Well, I don't understand. I said, you try to do the right thing. You try to live your life the way that, the Gospels talk about, and the way the church talks about. But man, I just don't. I mean, I just mess up constantly, and I don't know how do you do it?" And Simeon gets this really confused look on his face, and he says, "What are you talking about?" And I explain that again. I can't go without messing up, or sinning or whatever. And he says, "Are you Jesus?" And I'm like, what are you talking? I'm like, what are you talking about? You know, Father Simeon. And he says, well, are you Jesus Christ? And I said, no. And he says, well, Jesus Christ was the only person that was able to, by his own power, walk through this life and not sin. And so he says, do your best, go to confession, and let Jesus worry about the sins. That's why he died for us, you know. And I'm like, trying to sort that out, and I look up, and he's already walking back to his apartment. He'd given me what he wanted to say and was on his way. And that's just kind of how Simeon was, you know. But it made me, he just put it back into perspective. It's like, if we're trying to do this on our own power, then we're missing the point of Christ's sacrifice, you know.
So, you know, when you put people in your life into categories, did Father Simeon kind of fall into all of the categories at some point in time?
Yeah, I mean, he was there certainly at opportune times that I needed him, and he was an acquaintance for a while I was going to Boise State, and then he became the person that really, in many ways, significantly changed my life. Yeah.
And you, in the book, you talk about many encounters with Father Simeon, mm-hmm. and how he helped you with the moving from just the intellectual conversion into the conversion of your heart, mm-hmm. and how important that was.
Yeah, and you can't force that. That just happens. Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, with all due respect, again, to other faith traditions, I don't think you can magically sit down and force, you know, yourself to convert, to force a conversion. You can't. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's got to come, I think, in its own way, in its own time, and you know, Father Simeon sort of guided that, but it didn't happen instantaneously, mm-hmm. or overnight. It was a journey.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah.
That was. I really liked your. I really liked the transition from a teenager going to a monastery that you couldn't quite believe existed, but it was peaceful. But that can't be real, but it was peaceful. Mm-hmm. That full circle, mm-hmm. back to where maybe the first seeds were planted, mm-hmm. in your head.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So if you're interested in any of Pete's books, A Teen for Christ, The Beatitudes, or the story of his journey through recovery, you can contact Pete at St. John's Center on ISU campus, and he will be happy to share with you. Our next program will be Pete talking more in depth about his book and teens. Thank you for joining us. Please join us again. My name is Liz Johnson, and on behalf of the Holy Spirit Catholic community, thank you for joining us.
Amen.